Well, hello everyone. It's 7 o'clock. We're going to begin our study this evening. We're going to begin in Judges chapter 6, and we're going to study Judges chapter 6, 7, and 8. Before I begin the study, though, I want to thank Terry and James and Joe and Rick. They just did an outstanding job last night, helping lead us all before the throne of God, helping us all understand that God is still with us. And I appreciate so much the passages they read from God's Word. And I appreciate so much the sentiments of their heart that they led on our behalf. I'm so very thankful that we have these men, along with Breck and Mike as well. Also, Jordan and I have been doing this for some time now on Wednesday evening. That's a statement of the obvious. But one thing you may not know is that Eric Peterson is the one that makes this work. And I want to thank Eric personally for the work that he does behind the scenes. Eric got me and Jordan set up with a video program. All we hit is start streaming, and Eric takes care of the rest. And I really appreciate Eric's work on this, and I believe he was at the building last night to help make that streaming possible as well. He spends a lot of time helping us be available so we can have this medium, so we can have this kind of Bible study together. So thanks a lot, Eric, for your good work. Well, we come to Judges chapter 6. And this begins the story of Gideon. Gideon is an interesting individual. But before we get there, there's something that happens in the first part of chapter 6 that God had warned the children of Israel about. In fact, prior in this book, God had said, I'm going to leave those people you did not drive out as a test for you. And we learned that the Israelites failed the test. And God said, what's going to happen is they're going to come and they're going to take your land. They're going to take everything you got. Well, they're impoverished. The Israelites are impoverished. They are brought low. And what's happening is the Midianites are waiting until the harvest is ripe, and they're kind of hanging around the corner watching. And as soon as they see the harvest is ripe, man, they swoop down upon them and they seize all the crops that they have. And that's exactly what God had warned the children of Israel that would take place. Moses had warned about it in the book of Deuteronomy. In the book of Joshua, we see the same kind of warning. And now we're seeing it play out because they did not drive the inhabitants out of the land. And so God sends a prophet in verses 7 and 8. And the prophet said, I told you so. I told you this would happen. The prophet says, your misery is not your biggest problem. Your biggest problem is your obedience. It's not the Midianites, it's you. If they had driven the people out of the land, as God had commanded for them to do, they would not be in this kind of hard dilemma. But because they did not, they began to do evil. In fact, verse 1 says that then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. What that simply means is they began to worship the God of the Canaanites. Man, what a distraction, what a fall. So God sends a prophet to say, look, folks, if you think the Midianites are your problem, you need to look in the mirror, because they're not the problem, you are, and your disobedience is your problem. Well, then God sends an angel. And this time he sends an angel to Gideon. You find in verse 11, now an angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth tree, which was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, while his son Gideon threshed wheat in the winepress in order to hide it from the Midianites. Well, Joash's father and family are idol worshipers. And God now appeals to Gideon. And Gideon is in the winepress. Okay, I didn't start. I started with something else on my mind. I forgot to tell you to get your paper. I hope you already know to do that. Get your paper and your pencil, something to draw with. Now, my graphics department really overdid herself this week. And so I want to show you this picture of Gideon in the wine press. You see the wine press here? the winepress would have been a low place in the ground. That's not usually where they thresh the wheat. Here's Gideon, and here's the winepress. They're threshing the wheat in the winepress. What I want you to do is try to draw a low place, a box, and try to just shade it in and draw a stick figure standing in that box. And that will represent Gideon. Gideon threshing out the wheat in the winepress. Now, the thing that's unusual about that is you usually threshed out the wheat on the hill, because they would take a fork, a large pitchfork, and they would take the wheat and they would throw it up in the air, and the shaft would blow away and the wheat would fall. But here they're doing it in a winepress because they want to hide it. Why do they want to hide it? Because of what we just described. The Midianites are coming down, they're swooping down and taking all they've got. But the other thing that's interesting here is Gideon is going to be called a man of valor, but he's hiding. He's hiding. And so Gideon, in verse 13, it says, the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, the Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor. Gideon said to him, O my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has this happened to us? Does that sound familiar to you? Does that sound like the children of Israel wandering in the wilderness? Why didn't you bring us out here? Did you bring us out here to die? Did you bring us out here to starve us to death? Why didn't you just leave us in Egypt? Well, if God was going to be with them, then why has all this happened? And then Gideon recites history correctly. In fact, he will say, and where are all the miracles which our fathers told us about? Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites. And so God had brought them up. There's something interesting as a sidebar, as a side point here. Notice it says, where are all the miracles which our fathers told us about? Now, do you remember when we studied in the first part of Judges? You come to chapter 2, and all those who followed the generation of Joshua and the people of his land, they knew not God. But here's Gideon, and the fathers are telling them about the miracles. So Gideon at least had heard about the miracles of God. So that meant at least somebody's doing part of their job by telling their children and succeeding generations about the wonderful works of God. And so Gideon was correct. God did give them over. And then we come to verse 14. Then the Lord turned to him and said, go in this might of yours, and you shall save Israel from the land of the Midianites. Have I not sent you? So he said to him, O my Lord, how can I save Israel? Indeed, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. Lord, I'm just not strong enough. I'm just not big enough. Time out. Does that sound like anybody we've encountered in the Bible before? Maybe Moses? I can't go. I can't speak. Who will I say has sent me? How will they know to believe me? Gideon's saying the same thing. I'm just from a small tribe. Who am I? The Lord said, I will be with you. Gideon is a man, mighty man of valor because of the Lord's presence. Well, in verses 19 through 23, what you have then is Gideon went in and prepared a young goat for the angel that was there, of unleavened bread from an ephah of flour. The meat he put in a basket, and he put the broth in a pot, and he brought them out to him under the terebinth tree and presented them to him. And then you have it taking place in verse 21. The angel of the Lord put out the end of the staff that was in the hand and touched the meat, and the unleavened bread and fire rose out of the rock and consumed the meat and unleavened bread. The angel of the Lord departed out of his sight. And Gideon perceived this had been the Lord. Once the angel, the Lord, leaves, now Gideon realizes who it is. But put a peg on that fire that happened there just a little bit. So now then what God tells Gideon to do is what I want you to do is I want you to get a young bull of your father's. I want you to take a second bull. And what I want you to do is I want you to tear down this altar of Baal. Again, we see that his family were idol worshipers. Here's the altar of the town. And so what we have here then is we have him taking the ox or the bull and taking the altar, and they're going to pull down that altar. So what you might draw is you might draw some bricks on top of one another. And then you might draw a stick cow with a rope off of his neck going back over the rocks like this. And have that cow, that ox, pulling down the bale that's there, pulling them down. Well, when does Gideon do this? Gideon does it at night, which might say something about his timidity. Well, the next day, people wake up and they see, whoa, this altar has been torn down. And they want to know who did this. And they want the guy that did it to pay for it. And so they are enraged about this. Well, they go to Joash's house and they said, give us your son. We want him. He's got to answer for the destruction of Baal. And what you have Joash speaking here is really rather profound. He will say in verse 31, but Joash said to all who stood against him, would you plead for Baal? Would you save him? Let the one who would plead for him be put to death by morning. If he's a god, let him plead for himself because his altar's been torn down. You get what he's saying? What he's saying is, if Baal's a god, then let him fight his own fights. I'm not going to turn my son over to him. Let him fight his own fights. Well, that does say something commendable about Joash. At least he stood up for his son. Though he may have been an idol worshiper, he at least had enough sense to realize that if Baal's a god, he doesn't need these men to fight for Baal. Baal can fight for himself. In fact, Jehovah's going to fight for himself. So then we turn to verse 36. So Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, look, I shall put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. And so for 2 times now, he's going to put a fleece of wool. The first time, we're going to find that the fleece of wool, the ground is going to be dry only and the wool is going to be wet. And so what you have then is you have a fleece of wool that's here. You have a fleece of wool that's here. Here is Gideon bending over, and he's squeezing out the moisture from that wool that's there. In fact, I have another picture of wool. What you have here is a picture of wool. And so what you may do is just draw something like a cloud and color it in, and we'll call that wool. Well, here's Gideon then and the fleece. We know all about the fleece story. Sorry about that. We know all about the fleece story. Let me ask you a question. Don't you think once would have been enough? But Gideon's not happy. He said, do not be angry with me, but let me speak just once more. Let me test. I pray just once more with the fleece. Let it now be dry only on the fleece, but on the ground let there be dew. And God did so that night, and it was dry on the fleece, but there was no dew on the ground. That tells us a lot about Gideon's character, I think. His disposition to doubt. God, are you really going to do it this way? Now, I said put a peg on the fire there, because if you go back to what happens in verse 21, you saw the angel of the Lord was there. His hand touched the meat and the unleavened bread, and a fire rose out of the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread. And the angel of the Lord departed out of his sight, and then he knew it was the Lord. So you have that fire that rises out of the rock. And now then you have the wool that's drenched and the ground is dry. Wouldn't that be enough? But Gideon says, let me test you one more time. And God gives in. God does that. Gideon is not a strong man in and of himself. He needs more signs. In fact, I'm reminded in the New Testament, whenever Jesus came around, the Pharisees always asked for a sign, always asked for a sign. One more sign, one more sign. Well, Gideon does rise. And so we come to chapter 7. Chapter 7 is a fun chapter. They have no military strength. You see that in verses 1 through 3. You said, now, Jerubbaal, that's Gideon, and that was the name that was given to him by his father after the incident where they wanted to come and take him out of the house. Rose early and camped beside the well of Harod. So the camp of the Midianites was on the north side of them by the hill of Morah in the valley. And the Lord said to Gideon, the people who are with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into your hand. Lest Israel claim glory for itself against me, saying, mine own hand has saved me. Now that statement is going to become important in chapter 8. Because in chapter 8, they're going to say, Gideon, you saved us. They still don't get it was the Lord. But back to chapter 7. Chapter 7 really surrounds this fact that they begin with 32,000 versus 135,000. That's not very good odds. God says that's not enough. All those guys that are afraid, tell them they go back home. In fact, it was written in the law. If you're afraid, you go back. God wants them fighting for him. He wants them convinced that he is God and have their faith and trust in him. So he says, I want you to do another test. And what I want you to do is I want you to cut it down. And so it's cut down to 300. And you had 300 now versus 135,000. 450 to 1. Those are the odds. We would not call those good odds. But God has them just where he wants them now. God loves these odds. In fact, you will see also in verse 10, Gideon is kind of arguing about this, and he said, if you're afraid, go down to the camp with Purah, your servant, and you shall hear what they say. Afterward, your hand shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. Then he went down with Purah, his servant, to the outpost. If you're afraid, go down. Well, he was afraid, so he went down. And so what you had the men drinking from the river. But those that did not drink were 300. He says, everyone that laps from the water with his tongue as a dog, you shall set him apart by himself. Likewise, everyone who does not go down to his knees to drink. And the number of those who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people got down on their knees. Those that lapped were the 300 men, and they're the ones that became the mighty men. So you might draw a river, and you might draw some men kind of bending over, drinking from the river like this. Again, he says, those 300 men will be the ones, the 300 who lapped. I will save you and deliver the Midianites into your hand. That all the other people go, for every man to his place. And so the 300 go with Gideon, and the 300 are going to fight. And so we come down to what happens. Again, another ingenious story, another ingenious part of this story takes place. This is just filled with so many storylines. And so you got 300 men versus 135,000. So the Midianites, they're camped out at night. And there's 300 men. So Gideon says, you take 100 men, you go this way. You take 100 men and go this way. And I'll take 100 men and go this way. So they're divided up into three. 100 men in each group. They're going to surround the camp. And at the right time, the horn is going to sound. They're going to break their pitchers. The fire is going to come out. And the Midianites, they think they're surrounded by enemies, and they fled. And the ones that don't flee, they go down and they conquer them. And so we have them blowing their horns, breaking their pitchers, and the fire comes out. And you can see the Midianites, they're all encamped down here. And they're just shocked. They're stunned by what's taking place. And they look at the hill, and they see the lights all over the hill there. And out of fear, they begin to run. And like I said, then those that did not, they go down and they kill all the Midianites. And so what you have then, he had said, I want you to go down and conquer these people. And so it says, verse 19, so Gideon and 100 men who were with him came to the outpost at the beginning of the middle of the watch, just as they posted the watch, and they blew the trumpets and broke the pitchers that were in their hands. Every man stood around the camp. 300 blew their horns, and they began to scatter. And so Gideon reigned triumphant. Gideon is triumphant here. Gideon had also called men of Israel to gather together from Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh, and then they pursued all the Midianites. Again, notice, he gathered men of Israel from Naphtali, Asher, Manasseh, and they pursued the Midianites, and they conquered them. In fact, they captured two of their princes, Oreb and Zeb. Well, I wish the story stopped there. Because in chapter 8, things take a downhill turn. We begin to learn some things about Gideon that really are not very complimentary about him. But first, what we have is the men of Ephraim. They begin to find out about this. And they begin to argue with him. How come you didn't call us? Why are you just calling us now? Why didn't you call us earlier? Notice, he called the men from Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh to come fight. He didn't call the men of Ephraim. The men of Ephraim are now upset because they were not called. In fact, they kind of reprimand him and accuse him fiercely. They're really complaining for not being involved in the initial attack of the Midianites. They will be involved later. How does Gideon respond to that? How does Gideon respond to that? What Gideon says to them is rather brilliant. Someone has said it's a soft answer that turns away wrath, and what he does is he flatters them and said, look, you guys have done a whole lot more than we have done. You guys are greater than we are. What y'all have done is greater than anything we've done. Y'all have done great things. Instead of saying, the reason I didn't call you was because God told me to take the 300 men and you weren't part of the 300 men. But instead, he kind of pats them on the back and lovey-doveys them and says, well, you guys are greater than we are, and so you've already done so much. We're so small. You're so great. When he talks about small, he's talking about his father's clan. You're so great, and so you are so mighty. Well, in verse 4, he's still pursuing the Midianites. Gideon came to Jordan and 300 men. They crossed over. They're exhausted, but they still pursue. So they come to the men of Zuccoth, and they ask the men of Zuccoth. They say, please give us loaves of bread for the people. They're exhausted. And I presume Zubah and Zalmunna, kings of Manasseh. Well, what do the people of Zuccoth do? They say, have you caught them all yet? Have you caught those two guys yet? You're pursuing them. Do you have them? And no, we're not going to give you any bread. No, you just need to go on. And so Gideon says, okay, when I come back from the book of Ricky, I'm going to take some barbed wire and I'm going to thrash you with barbed wire. And you didn't help us. You stood down because you were fearful that they might not be defeated, and if they beat us, they'll come back and they'll get you. And so, okay, I'm going to remember that. I'm not going to forget what you did. And so they say, we're not sure we want to help. We want to stand behind. And so you have verse 9. He says, so he spoke to the men of Penuel, saying, when I come back in peace, I will tear down this tower. That tower would have been the pride of their city. Like he tore down the altar of Baal before. Now he's going to tear down this tower. I'm going to tear down the pride of your city. And in verse 10, there were 120,000 Midianites who had perished. So he says in verse 10, now Zebah and Zalmunna were at Karkor, and their armies with them, about 15,000, all who were left of the army of the people of the east, for 120,000 men who drew the sword had fallen. So 120,000 have fallen by now. They start out with 135. Now they got 120,000, so they got 15,000 that are left. And what they do is they rout them. These men begin to panic, and they run, they flee. Well, they capture Zebah, and they capture Zebah and Zalmunna, and they bring them. But Gideon hasn't forgotten what the people of Zuccoth did. And so he captures the people and comes back and says, now will you give us bread? Now I've got them right here. Do you see them? You see, I've caught them. We captured them. And what he does is then he slays the people of Zuccoth. Now, what is so bad about that is these are his own people. These are not Canaanites. At this point, Gideon becomes a loose cannon. Revenge beyond what they deserved, he begins to exact upon them. And he kills them. And then he tells his son, I want you to draw the sword, and I want you to kill him. And the son says, look, I'm just a boy. I can't do this. And Gideon says, Zebah and Zalmunna, if you hadn't killed my brothers, I wouldn't kill you. I am the least tribe. I am nothing. He starts off, but now in a good way, but now this has gone to his head. And if you had not killed my brothers, I would not kill you. Now power has gone to his head. He starts out gentle and timid and ends vengeful. He now has his own agenda for revenge. He's no longer following the Lord. And that's the sad part. And when he kills Zebah and Zalmunna, he takes the crescent. In fact, what it will say is in verse 21, he takes the crescent ornaments that were on their camels. It's one thing to take the spoils, but these were the displays of royalty. They were symbols of power and symbols of authority. Gideon's life is unraveling before us. It took a while for Gideon to be convinced that God would use him purposely to save Israel. But now Gideon is coming unraveled. His revenge is exacting on his own people, and now he kills these two kings, and he takes their symbol of royalty. And as a result of killing Zebah and Zalmunna, the people say, we want to make you a king, and your children, all that are after you. And it's noble that Gideon says, no, we're not going to be king. But then he starts to act like a king. He starts to act like a king. He's already taken the spoils of royalty. You've saved us. Look at verse 22. Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, rule over us, both you and your son, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian. Go back to chapter 6 real quick. Chapter 7. He says, so the Lord said to Gideon, everyone who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps, you shall set him apart. And the number of those who lapped, putting their hand, were 300. The Lord said to Gideon, by 300 men who lapped, I will save you and deliver the Midianites into your hand. I will save you. I will deliver the Midianites into your hand. But now they notice what they say. Gideon, you did this. They do not attribute that to God. You go down, you took 300 men. No possible human way this could happen. But they still think it was because of Gideon. Gideon resists being a king. But he's going to act like it, and he embraces the lifestyle. So verse 24, it says, then Gideon said to them, I would like to make a request of you. Each of you would give me earrings from his plunder, that golden earrings, because they were Ishmaelites. In fact, the weight was about 40 pounds of gold is what it would amount to. Remember what a king was said to do? A king would take all of your wealth. I'm not going to be a king, but I'll take all the rewards of a king. Contrast that. Contrast that with Abraham when he goes to recover Lot and the people try to give Abraham some reward. He said, no, all I want is I want you to feed my guys. I just want you to take care of my expenses. I don't want anything that you have to give. But here Gideon is different. Give me all that you have in your treasury. And then he builds an ephod. An ephod would have been a garment that the high priest wore, but it also could have been something else. And because it says here that he built an ephod and they worshiped it and it became a snare to his family, I think it probably was more like an altar, another altar that was built. It was a snare to Gideon and his family. And so Gideon's actions now begin to affect his family. Again, unraveling before our eyes. They built an altar to worship pagan things. Gideon is chosen by God, but no fundamental focus on God. I think that's important for us to see. Let me make this observation. The church is not an idol. We worship the Lord and we need to be Christ-centered. Gideon was used by God, but God is not the center of his heart. God needs to be the center of our heart. It's not the church we worship. It's the Lord we worship. I think that's important. And we can't set the church up as an idol to worship the church. I'm not diminishing the power and the importance of the church. The church is people, saved people. But we don't worship the people. Well, in verses 28 through 40, verse 28 says, the Midianites were subdued before the children of Israel, so that they lifted their heads no more. And the country was quiet for 40 years in days of Gideon. You know what's sad about that? Is that's never said again in the book of Judges. It's never said again in the book of Judges that they had rest. They'll have some victories, but no more is it going to say they lifted their heads no more and the country was quiet. That's sad. And then it says, then Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, went and dwelt in his own house. No more than 10 times will Jerubbaal be referred to going forward. Most of that in chapter 9. And no more is he referred to as Gideon. The name which began because he took down an altar now becomes the name representing idolatry. In fact, he will talk about a place where they've left off God in Bel-Berith. Bel-Berith means Lord of the Covenant. God's no longer their God. Gideon means hacker because he disposed of the pagan idols. Jerubbaal was his pagan name, and now we see how he lives out the last of his years. It says that what he had was concubines. Gideon had 70 sons who were his offspring, for he had many wives, and concubines who were in Shechem also bore him a son. Shechem was a Canaanite city. A Canaanite city. He has all the sons, all the wives that would be represented by a king, that a king would have. He even has a concubine in Shechem and has a son. And he names him Abimelech. Abimelech means my father is king. He wanted the lifestyle, he wanted the prestige, and he wanted the power. And so we see his life ends in a very dishonorable kind of way with the way that he lived. Chapter 9, we're going to see the decline of his family that takes place. Again, don't you wish the story had ended at the end of chapter 7 when things were so good? But Gideon takes a downward turn. So before I close, I want to bring some things home to us. I want us to think about some things that I think are really important for us to learn from these stories. First of all, I hope it's obvious the power of influence that others have on us must not be underestimated. We see the influence on Gideon all the way through. We see the influence of Gideon at times. We can't underestimate the power of influence that others have upon us. Second, learning to trust God. Learning to trust God, especially when we feel weak and inadequate. Gideon said, I'm but a small guy from a little tribe. God, can you do it again? Can you do it again? And God gives them the victory from the least number of men. But then Gideon begins to take the power into his own hands at the end. Learning to trust God, especially when we feel weak and inadequate. In fact, one thing I'm reminded of from this story, if you'll put your finger there in Joshua, I'm saying Judges, I want to turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 12 real quick. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, I think what you have in this particular passage is kind of a marquee verse of this story. In verse 9 of chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians, my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast of my infirmities that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. I think that's a passage that rings throughout this story. When we're weak, that's when God is strong. It's not that God's not strong before, but that's when we realize how strong and mighty God is. Gideon, again, in of himself, had no power, but God empowered him. He clothed him with power. It's important to trust God when we feel weak and inadequate. Gideon had to take an unpopular stand. He tore down the idols. He tore down his father's idols, the idols of the town. And Gideon had to stand up and take an unpopular stand. It might have gone to his head later, the success. But we've got to admire at least Gideon stood and took the battle and defeated the Midianites and crushed the Midianites at last. I think it's important to keep focused on the mission. Keep it focused on the mission when distractions come. So the distractions come all through the story to Gideon. The distractions come especially with Zebah and Zalmunna. They come from his own people because they refuse to feed his man. And in chapter 8, we see he lost his focus. It's important to keep our focus. And then I think it's important, and I've said this over and over in these studies, and I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but it's really leaving a spiritual legacy for those who follow. You know, when Caleb died, Othniel took over, and you see the success of Caleb continuing his family. For what little we know about Othniel. But now in chapter 9, Abimelech's going to take over, and it's going to go sour. It's going to go sour. It's so important to leave a strong spiritual legacy, so that third generation does not fall away, but so that third generation has implanted in their hearts a love for God and his word and God's people. And then God uses ordinary, small things, ordinary, small people, down-to-earth people, to accomplish his purpose. A fleece burning out of a rock. What you had is you had a pitcher, you had a horn, and you had a fire. A fire, a pitcher, and a horn. And when that pitcher was broken and the ram's horn blew, small, insignificant things, God used them. And then finally, I would say, success is determined by God's power, not our own. Success is determined by God's power, not our own. Now, let's leave Judges for just a moment. And there's one last passage I want us to look at. I want you to turn with me to Hebrews chapter 11. I want you to look at chapter 11, or at least just listen to me here. Gideon, at last, went on his own agenda. He killed people that were his own people. He began to take the place of a king. He had 70 sons by multiple wives. He had a concubine in a Canaanite city. And the offspring of that concubine, Abimelech, began to rule, and things went south. What might you have thought about that? What might you have thought about Gideon then? Well, here is an amazing thing. Because in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 30, by faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. By faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail to tell me of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, and Samuel. Time would fail me to tell of who? Of Gideon. Do you see where Gideon's at? And in chapter 12, he will talk about the great cloud of witnesses that encompass us. In chapter 11 is not an exhaustive list, it's a representative list of those cloud of witnesses that encompass us, that cheer for us to be successful in our walk with God. And who's in that cloud of witnesses? Who's there? Gideon's there. Gideon's there. Is that amazing? I just find that amazing. Go figure. Gideon's there. Well, for all the failures of Gideon that we saw in chapter 8, evidently there was something about his heart that God saw as a man of faith that God appreciated so much. The Holy Spirit recorded his name for us to see as part of the cloud of witnesses of people who served God by faith and were pleasing to God because by faith they believed that there is a God and they worshiped him. I don't know how that makes you feel, but I got to tell you, that really makes me feel pretty good. Because if Gideon, with all of his mistakes, all of his failures, sometimes his not-headed moves, sometimes it's just brainless actions, can be in Hebrews chapter 11, then what that means is there's hope for me and there's hope for every one of us. That's why we have them. In fact, Barak's there. You remember last week from Jordan's lesson? Barak wouldn't go down and fight without Deborah going. He was a big mama's baby. He was a coward without Deborah. And then he didn't get the battle. Jael got the reward. Barak's there. A coward, a big mama's baby's there. And here are two men that are amazing. And we haven't got to Jephthah yet in the book of Judges. He's yet to come. So it's just an amazing story. It just stands out. Gideon at last was a hero. And we have to acknowledge that. But heroes sometimes make mistakes. Being a hero doesn't mean that you are perfect and sinless. But God's book shows us the good, the bad, and the ugly about people. But alas, we see Gideon was a man of faith, accepted by God. Wonderful story. Well, next week, the story will pick up in Judges chapter 9. If you can come Sunday, I look forward to seeing you. Jody and I love you, and Jody and I miss you. And we just pray that as soon as possible, this COVID-19 will just disappear. Maybe some vaccine can be found so that people can feel comfortable getting together again. Jordan will do a great job preaching Sunday. I look forward to hearing him. I always look forward to his lessons. I always look forward to his classes as well. And so, stay safe and stay healthy. My arms are open wide to hug every one of you. We love you, and have a good evening.